Hey guys, welcome to part 4 of my character monster production series. And in this part we'll add some surface detail to our scope, and we also polypaint our high poly mesh. And I'll start by importing some alpha textures that I'll be using later, and I'll talk more about them a bit later too. So basically I'll start adding some surface detail now so it actually looks like skin. So I usually start by using the elastic brush, take it down the scene intensity to about 30, and then I'll use spray brush or spray mode and take the brush alpha that you see there, and I'll start adding some pores to his skin, as you can see there. And here you can see I'll just start adding some pores to him. I'm not adding it in every place, I'm just adding them where I think it belongs. So let's say his belly, his back, maybe on his shoulders, his knees there, calves, and places where you usually would see pores more than the others. And now I actually started using drag rectangular mode for my elastic brush, and started using my brush alphas. And basically what you can do is you can pretty much find a bunch of textures that you can use in CG textures completely for free. You can then import them into Zbrush and use it as your alpha for your brush. And before you do that, you usually want to turn on surface. If you go to your alpha panel, and at the bottom there at the bottom of the tab you should see their surface mode, and you should enable that on your alphas. So when it comes to textures, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really have to be skin textures, because as you can see, I'm pretty much using textures that I think can fit. So it usually be some moss textures, some even metal textures, or like stains. So you can pretty much build up your texture library. It doesn't have to actually be skin. You can use whatever you think will fit for your monster, and you just have to use it correctly, is what I'm trying to say. You can't actually just use whatever texture you want and wherever you want on your mesh. So here I actually use some cloth texture that I found on his cloth parts, and it didn't really give me effect that I wanted, but it was good enough for what I was aiming. And as you can see, this technique is really good for adding these small surface details. Really brings out your sculpt a lot, and it's fairly fast. Just takes about 10 minutes max. So as you can see there, I'm usually using drag mode for my elastic brush, and like I said before, scene intensity at about 30. You don't want it too high, or it'll deform your sculpt too much. So here I'm using another different texture for the cloth, and I'll probably include these textures in the video description so you can download the ones that I used. Here I'm using some stains, I think blood stains actually, and it works pretty well for a cloth. And I'll have some metal textures for his blades there. Nothing too special, fairly simple and really fast when it comes to this technique, and you can get cheap detail fast. Yeah, I'll be saving my monster, make sure you do that often. And here I'll start actually polypainting. So when I start polypainting, what I typically do is I take the skin shade material, as it gives I don't want my material to be too dark, so then I can see the actual colors that I'm using a lot better. And what I typically do is I usually find the base color, and then I'll check, and then I'll go to color and then apply to object, I believe it's called, which basically will apply the color that I selected to my subtool. And then when I come back to polypainting, I switch back to RGB mode. And as you can see here, I made the mistake, I didn't switch back to RGB mode, so I had mRGB there for a while, and you don't want that when you're polypainting. Just make sure you switch back to your RGB mode when you're polypainting, and when you want to sculpt something in, just turn it off and turn on the Z add mode. So about the polypainting process, what I usually do is I typically start by adding some manual ambient occlusion, some skin tones, as you can see here. Basically using darker values around parts where I want to add more depth. So I want to I usually want to make all of the forms pop more. So what that'll do is it'll add some depth to him, and that's how I usually start. So like I said, you can go back between sculpting and polypainting whenever you want. Just make sure you switch between your RGB mode and your Z add mode. And I started with using some red tones for his muscles and some manual AO and occlusion, just to pop his forms out, make them stand out, and after that I'll even go darker layer and even add more ambient occlusion where I basically feel it should be. Like it's usually in the parts where, let's say, his cloth there, where it ends, between the belly and the cloth. You want to make it darker so it adds more depth to it. Otherwise it'll look kind of flat and just look like the cloth is not actually outside his skin. And what I usually do is also I just paint in default color values into some misc stuff like his cloth there, as you can see. I'll just take a brown color, and just basically paint it in. And use reddish values for his wounds there and the scars. It's not too hard, After some practice, you'll get better at this, and it's a fairly simple process. And as you can see here, his tentacle starting to look even more like a third. And if you click on C, if you're holding on your model and you click on C, you can actually pick colors from your mesh, which is helpful sometimes if you want to find the same colors that aren't on your sculpt. So just press C key and then it'll pick the color value of where your cursor is. So as you can see there, I'm adding some more darker values around his muscles, usually around their contours. So, and you don't want it to be too strong, because then it just look too cartoony. So just basically have a pretty large brush and just don't go too dark with it in the beginning, at least. And he'll choose some kind of metalish color for his knife. Just block in the colors for that. And adding more darker values around his detail, the muscle details and whatnot. And for his feet, I wanted to make the feet kind of different color from this rest of the body. So I made them I kind of used this dark greenish color for that. It turned out pretty well. And, so usually you don't usually want your monster to have the same colors everywhere. Sometimes you want to add contrast and make some parts different from others. And, so like his tentacle there, he has the tentacle is kind of like this greenish yellowish color, just add some different color value from the rest of his body. And here I'm using that manual AO just to add some contrast between his cloth and his arm there and the knife. Just just paint it in wherever there's like these parts where it should be kind of darker, where the cloth there ends, for example. Fairly simple and fast. Usually around the edges, basically, and folds and cracks like these. And then after that, I usually actually pick a lighter value of color than the base color, and I'll just go in and add it on these parts that stick out more to add some contrast between the AO and this actual base color. Just makes your just makes it pop out a bit more, you know, add some contrast. It's always good. You don't want your colors to be flat, you know, because then it'll just look boring. In this car, as you can see, the stitches, and could have probably made those stitches look a lot better, but you know, like I said before, I didn't really spend too much time on this sculpt. But you know, feel free to take as much time as you need to perfect your monster. And, when I'm painting, by the way, I'm usually using the standard brush. Just make sure you enable the RGB mode and have your Z-add mode turned off. And I'll be using that color from the tentacle, and I'll be using it on the spores that I added to him to, you know, make his detail a bit different color from the rest of his body. That's a nice color variation. You want that. You know, it works pretty well for pores. You know, like I said before, I just start with the base color, you know, which is basically mid value, not too dark, not too bright, you know. Then I'll usually add darker value around it, and then at the end I'll just use a brighter value of the same color to make the forms pop a bit more, give it some nice contrast and depth, like you can see here. I took a bit lighter value there and just painted it at the very top of the pores, and it just gave it kind of nice effect. So sorry by the way for sounding like a zombie, you know. My mic's not the best, so my voice doesn't sound too well, and I also blame my Eastern European accent for that. Because here I'm trying to add some color variation there with the pores below, so then so it adds some diffusion. Here I start going in a bit more with the manual ambient occlusion, you know, to make his muscles and facial features basically add more depth to them, make them pop more. Very simple, you know, and it goes pretty fast once you've done it before. And later you'll see me using some of those textures that we use for the surface detail, and I'll actually use those textures for the polypaint as well. And here, as you can see, I'm actually going in and making a mask by cavity. What that does is basically it masks your surface detail, and then what you can do is you can actually invert your or you can use inverted mask or default one, and you can just go in and start painting in, and it'll actually add this cool detail. But I made my mask kind of sharp, so usually don't want it as sharp as I had it here. And when you mask, you can see when I'm painting, I actually don't see the mask itself. And how I did that was I just went to preferences, edit, and then you turn on or in the masked object, the dimming, you just make it to I believe 1 or 0, and that will basically hide your mask, and you won't be able to see it. So that in that way, you can just go in and start painting it those unmasked parts of your cavity mask, you know, and you can also invert the mask to get a different effect. So this way you can get some really make your surface details really stand out more and make them add depth to them. As you can see here, it really brings them out a bit, but you know, just make sure you don't have your cavity mask too sharp. I think I had it a bit too sharp in here, but you know, it in the end it still worked out well. Don't forget, you can, if you hold Control and then just press on the screen, you know, it'll invert your mask. It'll give it a different effect when you're painting. There, his face was kind of sharp, so I used didn't use the mask, and I just went in with a normal standard brush to just make them to blur them out a bit. Because if your surface details look too sharp, it just look weird. So you want to find that balance. And I used it to make these cracks, you know, stand out more. Just a darker value of the color and just paint it over. You know, gave it a nice effect. But like I said before, it was kind of too sharp for my taste. So, and you can adjust how sharp your cavity mask is by adjusting the curve, you know, in your masking and options. I'm trying to blur out the details a bit so they're not that sharp, especially on the back here. Using some different blood tones to give some more variation to the scars, so it's not only one color. Like I said, color variation is important when you're polypainting, because if you use the same colors, you know, it'll just look boring. And here I actually go in and using my texture maps that I've used before, which is basically the same principle. You just still use standard brush, you know, just make you can make your mode drag rectangular, and then you just choose your alpha images in brush alpha, and you can you just choose whatever color you want, and you can just start dragging these details out. And this is pretty much the final stage when you're polypainting. You want to use this very at the end, not in the beginning, because you want to get down the base color values and the shading down first before you actually use the textures. As you can see here, I'm using them wherever I feel like they fit. Some different moss and dirt textures usually work well, but you know, and I'll include all these textures in the description. So, but you know, you should try to build up your own texture library, you know. You can pretty much use whatever textures. It doesn't have to be, like I said before, it doesn't have to be skin textures, you know. Just some even metal textures can work fine, as long as you use them correctly. Yeah, we use this dirt texture, gave me quite a nice effect there on his belly. It had some bigger dirt stains. And remember, you don't want to use symmetry when adding details like these. And think about composition, you know. Don't just place them out randomly. You know, zoom out and look at your model as a whole, and see if the detail fits in there, and then that it's not out of place. Add some dirt on his face there, some blood. You know, you can use the same texture, you know, and then just change the color, and it'll give a completely different effect. Instead of looking like dirt, and it'll make it look like blood stains, which you want to add like on his knives, for example, or his cloth wraps there around his arm. Since, you know, why do you think the way he got his blades is basically he probably had to cut off his arm, so you would expect that there would be that those cloth wraps would be kind of bloody, you know. So, you know, when you're sculpting and when you're polypainting, you want to think about your design, you know. You should think a bit logically, you know. And when you do, you know, your texture look good. And I think at this point I'm almost done. Here I had some trouble, had to clean up this material, because before, like I said, I used the RGB, and when you're polypainting, don't use that, just use RGB mode. Otherwise you'll have to clean up your material later, but you know, it doesn't really matter since we're not going to use these materials in our game model, but you know, just for visual purposes, you want to keep your sculpt clean. I ended up switching to basic material, I think. Gave it a bit more of realistic shading. And here I started adding more textures to some parts. Use more lighter value than his skin tone to add some contrast in some parts, you know. And you wanna find that balance between contrast, you know, and colors. It can take a bit of practice, but you know, if you really become good at it, you know, you'll make your textures look a lot better rather than just flat and boring. Here, make some layout to his tentacle, and just to make it add more depth to it. Some more moss textures in some parts. The source were kind of flat, so I add some more red values to those. At this point I think it's kind of pretty much done, or just had the eyes left at this point, and I just made them a bit darker. And I forgot to subdivide them, so I had to do that, because when you're polypainting you want to use your highest subdivision level, because when you're polypainting you're actually painting on the vertices and not on your UVs. And Just use some broken glass texture actually. So you can see there how you can use these textures from like glass and use it on something like ice, as long as you know where to use them. So that's pretty much sums up the poly painting, and we're pretty much ready to start on our game model. In the next part, I'll be covering a Z-remesher and some other retopology concepts and techniques that you can use. So yeah, I'll see you in the next part. Bye.